everybody, welcome to week 3. We got to see last week what it looks like when we are tested, how to stand up under those tests. And we continue to look at the temptations and where do temptations come from and why it's so important not to blame God when we come into temptation. You know, I don't know about you, but I've made probably some pretty foolish purchases in my life. I remember when I was in high school, I had a really great running car, but I sold it so I could get a Camaro Z28. It was red. It looked great. The car was something that you'd see on a showroom. I thought it was perfect. I had many people that warned me that said, hey, you know what? That car doesn't run that great. You shouldn't buy it. And they said other things like, hey, you know how much your insurance is going to be? And I said, no problem. I'll work a few more hours. It'll be all right. It took me months just to get the car on the road to drive it. And then after I started driving it, guess what? The insurance was so high that I had to work many extra hours to pay for it. That's called buyer's remorse. And often we have buyer's remorse when we see something on sale and we think, oh, I can't live without it. Now, what we're talking about in James is temptation that looks a little bit different than that because it has more consequences to it. Let me just read to you what James says. In James 1, starting in verse 13, it says, when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desires and enticed. Then, after desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, gives birth to death. As we see from our reading, our sin and temptation is really something that pulls us in. I think of it a lot like a fishing lure. If you're a fisherman, you know in your tackle box you have many different lures. And what we try to do is entice the fish to bite our lure. Sometimes we'll even use live bait to get them to bite. And when we're enticed by the things of this world and by sin, it looks a lot like that. My oldest son loves to travel out west. He goes out there usually at least 2 times a year, and he loves to adventure out there. He goes on all these hikes to different places, and his favorite place to go is in Wyoming. He goes to Jackson Hole a lot. And on his hikes, one of the things, because he's kind of just got this sense of adventure, he always wants to see wild animals. In fact, he has an app on his phone that says where there's bear sightings and the trails that have been closed. And I'm always very thankful when his wife goes with him because she has some pretty good common sense where he fails at that every once in a while. And she keeps him on the path. But even though the paths are marked, dangerous animals, wild animals, warnings here and there, don't get off the trail, he continues to venture off trails to find wild animals, just so he can take a video and send it to me. And I all the time tell him, don't be foolish, don't do those things. Well, a couple of years ago, he was traveling out west with one of his friends, and his wife wasn't going. And she gave him a pretty stern warning. She said, Devin, remember this, when you're out there, you have a wife and 2 daughters at home. Be smart. Well, of course, when he was with his friend, their adventurous side got the best of them, and they found themselves finding some trails that were closed because of the bear warnings. And of course, they got to see some cool animals, and they were really lucky that they didn't get eaten. But when I went with them 2 years ago, I found myself falling into the same trap. We were on a trail, we saw a moose, and I decided I wanted to get a video of it, so I chased the moose to get a video of it, knowing full well that in this part of the park, that moose attacks are even more frequent than bear attacks. But I was enticed by the thrill of the chase. So when we are enticed and we sin, oftentimes what we do is we blame God for our sin. But listen to how James changes the tone a little bit in the next couple verses. This is what he says. Don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights, who does not change like the shifting shadows. And James tells us that every good and perfect gift comes from God. And I think that's really important how James says this, because honestly, when we blame our temptation on God, it looks a lot like the very first sin. Think about it in Genesis 1, when they sin and they fall into temptation, what happens? When they're confronted by God, Adam blames God. He says, it was because of this woman that you gave me. And often when we sin, we fall into that temptation of blaming God. God, this is how you made me. You know I'm an angry person. Why did you create me this way? And instead of doing that, we should take ownership of our sin and take responsibility for it. It would be silly for me if I would have been chased by the moose to turn around and say it was the moose's fault for chasing and attacking me, or it was the warning sign's fault. That would just be silly. And that's what it looks like when we blame God for our temptation. James goes on to say this: my dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen and slow to speak and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Therefore, get rid of all moral filth and evil that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. James gives us a stern warning that we should be quick to listen and slow to speak. I don't know about you, but there's been several times that I have said something that I wish I could take back. In fact, my wife has a saying that she says quite frequently in our house. She says, when emotions are high, discernment is low. And that is true. When we are in a situation and we're confronted, oftentimes in those emotions, we speak words that we wish we could take back. Take time and listen and spend time to reflect instead of just lashing out at somebody. James goes on to really point out a picture of what it looks like to just be a listener and what it looks like to be a doer. How do we work out our faith? This is what he says. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourself. Do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in the mirror and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. But whoever looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues in it, not forgetting what they have heard, but by doing it, they will be blessed in what they do. When I think about what James tells us about not just listening to the word, but being doers of the word, and when we look at our face in the mirror and we see those problems, we should take action. We should work out our faith in this way. I have a great friend that's in ministry. He's been a pastor for many years and somebody that I confide in and I talk to frequently. And he shared a story about when he was in seminary. He said, seminary was really hard for me. He said, I struggled to make good grades. In fact, testing, I was challenged just to pass. He said in the end of his studies, his grade point average had dropped to such a level he didn't think he was going to be able to pass. And it was time for the final exam. He decided that he was going to ask one of his friends that was in seminary a year ahead of him if he could borrow his old exam to study from. Well, he ended up getting the exam and he studied all the answers from it. He was able to pass the test and get his degree. But for not just after he got his degree, for many years, this haunted him. He really thought about it, and he was so convicted about what he had done. He decided that he would call the university that he graduated from and ask them if he could take the test again and confess what he had done about cheating on the exam. Well, the university said, there's no way that you can do this. That's done. That's in the past, and we can't change that. So he was able to keep his diploma. But he was also so convicted about putting his friend in this compromising position that he called his friend and apologized to him. I think every single one of us are going to make mistakes. We're going to fail. We're going to sin. We're going to fall into temptation. but it's what we do in those moments. You see, God has given us great mercy, just like the university gave my friend great mercy. And so we live in that mercy. We need to not blame God for our temptations, but turn to him when we've fallen into them. Hey, you're going to have a great discussion this week. God bless.